Welcome back to Farm Food Facts, brought to you by the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. I'm your host, Joanna Guza. While we have our guests on the line, we want to get their insights on the future of agriculture and what they're keeping a close eye on. Our guests today were on an earlier episode talking about the new study from USFRA called Enhancing Farm Profitability Through Nitrogen, Efficiency, and Yield Stability. So I recommend that you check that out. We are joined with familiar voices on Farm Food Facts. We have Dr. Jerry Hatfield. He's a retired laboratory director with USDA's Agriculture Research Service National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment. And we also have Dr. Bruno Basso. He's a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Michigan State University. With this bonus episode, I'm going to read a sentence from the study and want to get both of your perspectives on it. Nitrogen fertilizer is the most critical input influencing corn production in the U.S. Midwest. Yet its efficiency remains low, with only 30 to 50% of applied nitrogen taken up by crops, while the rest is lost to leaching. Jerry, I'll have you go first, and Bruno, if you could add, what are 3 practices farmers can implement to combat nitrogen loss?
Well, if you look at nitrogen loss out there in the overall system, you really begin to say, what begins the overall process? And you have to realize that it's not just nitrogen alone. There's a water dynamic that goes with that. There's the seasonal growth of that plant and everything else. So 3 practices that really could impact nitrogen loss is: don't put as much nitrogen on. That would reduce the amount that leaves the system. The other piece is that, can we capture more nitrogen by placing it just when the crop needs it and everything, going to, instead of one-time application, maybe going to a split application of nitrogen. And the other one is a longer term, is saying, can we change that water dynamic within the soil to allow less leaching to occur, because now we've got a more efficient water capture system. It's just not draining through. And so it becomes a puzzle, as we've talked about before, that you now have got all these different moving parts. And the real problem in all of this is that weather is the most variable piece of this overall puzzle from year to year. So if we can manage how that rainfall is being captured into that soil, so that it isn't leaving as quickly as everything, and then we couple that with improved nitrogen management, we could have a major impact on nitrogen loss within the system. Because the other piece of this, in a lot of our previous work, is that the parts that we talk about, these low unstable zones within the field, that's probably the biggest culprit in terms of nitrogen loss into the environment. So focusing on how do we change that part of the field could have a tremendous impact on this, because that's our low efficiency zone, but it's also the part of field that actually has the greatest leaching coming through, because we just don't have all that capacity to hold that water within the field. So all of this is really a very complex problem, but it is solvable. You shouldn't just throw up your hands and say, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. As we understand these components, it's a matter of getting it into practice on the field.
Right. Bruno, your take?
Yeah, I would agree with what Jerry said. And again, after studying this complex problem for several years now, my message, to the farmers would be, we have learned that nitrogen response across the field, it's not constant. And so these low and stable zones are a low-hanging fruit where you could minimize the nitrogen application and get a significant improvements in nitrate leaching and avoiding losses, because we have shown that it's much more water driving the system and not lack of nitrogen. So reducing nitrogen on the low yielding zones, and it's clear that nitrogen is fundamental to get the level of yields that we need, but not in areas where we have shown there is no response. That's what drives low nitrogen use efficiency. So focusing on the high yielding zones to boost yields, reducing nitrogen on the low yielding zones, it's certainly a piece. Improving rotations is always something that leads as being a critical, contribution from science, because improvement in soil health occurs from changing crops. both from disease standpoint, the level of residues management. And so most farmers are resonating much more with that. And so increasing any practices that allows to improve soil health, it's certainly something that goes into the overall improvement of the system. But the yield stability maps really have shown the opportunity to reduce losses from a profit standpoint by improving nitrogen management, by limiting application in low yielding areas and focusing on the isomes. As a much larger, act of faith and moving forward, which I think will eventually be rewarded, is to having precision conservation, which if the area is large enough, then don't plant corn. You can get, return on investment by changing land use, whether it's pollinators or, clovers or alternative that will really mitigate the losses of nitrogen to either the atmosphere or to the groundwater.
That last voice was Dr. Bruno Basso. He's a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Michigan State University. And you also heard from Dr. Jerry Hatfield. He is a retired laboratory director with the USDA Agriculture Research Service National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in again. I'm Joanna Guza for Farm Food Facts. All right, I thought that part went good. There's one more thing I might ask for you guys to do, because Jerry made a comment that we're going to be sending this out to like crop advisors. If a farmer's listening to this, and I'm probably going to use the video portion of this and probably the audio, what would you advise a farmer to ask their crop advisor when it comes to yield stability and nitrogen efficiency? What questions should the farmer be asking their crop advisor? And Jerry or Bruno, whoever would like to go first.
I think one that is, have they heard of yield stability? Let's start with that basic piece of this puzzle.
That is what I would have said. Have they heard about it?
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I don't want to say anything negative, but they may work with a retailer that their goal is just to continue to sell fertilizer. And so they need to understand that we'll come back to them if they can't sell on a longer term. So be able to understand, have you heard about yield stability? Can you help me quantify it? Or how can I get it for my own field? And just, those level of question. Now, I think, unfortunately, the response from the advisor will be that they continue to probably think that low yielding areas should receive more nitrogen, right, which is really harmful. And so maybe understanding if that's the direction they're going, it's a little bit of a trigger to see if the advisor is really helping them or not.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with that with Bruno, is that when I've asked and shown maps of fields and everything else and asked consultants, what part of that field should you put the most nitrogen on? If you show them the organic matter map and they say, well, this is low organic matter, they say, well, that needs to have more nitrogen because it doesn't have any reserve in the soil. And then you have to couple the water piece of that, and they go, oh, now I think it's a matter of getting them educated as to these dynamics as well, because it does change the whole nitrogen paradigm, Joanna. Is it really, we've gone through this whole thing of 50, 60 years of nitrogen, well, even more than that, when they've just assumed all these different pieces. And now with this yield stability and some of the other research that we've done, is that we've changed that paradigm and put it on top of its head and saying, oh, there's another factor that you need to consider because this is what's driving the process. And all of a sudden, the world's changed. And I think we've got to get that dialogue back to them and saying, here's the questions you need to be asking, and get it back on a profitability piece and saying, are you getting the most out of every acre in your field? And if you're not, what do you need to change? And I think that may become a hard question at times, but I think it's a question that agriculture needs to ask. I mean, there's been so many articles about the low commodity prices and all these things this last growing season. that I think is an opportune time to saying, should you be doing things differently? Well, yes, you should. And it's really, but and now the question becomes, how do you do them differently?